Have you just finished your first quilt top and you're wondering how to turn that piece of fabric, that beautiful piece of fabric that you sewed all together, into an actual quilt, and you want to do it the fastest and easiest way? Well, this is the video for you. First though, if you have not seen my other video about how to layer all your layers together and baste them together, you should check that out right up here. But once you have everything all basted together, then it's time to start doing your quilting. There are all sorts of ways to do machine quilting. You can do lots of squiggly lines with fancy machines, or you can even easiest send it off to someone else called a long armer to do your quilting for you. But if you're eager to make that whole quilt all by yourself, then you should first try doing straight line machine quilting. Straight line machine quilting is not squiggles. Doesn't have to be perfectly straight lines, but it has to be maybe gentle curving lines or fairly straight lines. So if you can work out a pattern for that and baste up your quilt, I'll show you how to do it. Before we get started quilting though, I just wanted to say two things about setup. First, you do need to have a walking foot. A walking foot is a special foot for your machine. I talk more about it in this video up here, but it makes sure that you don't get wrinkles as you're sewing the layers of the quilt together. Go check out that video if you don't know what it is or why I'm talking about it. The second thing you need to have is to make sure that you're using an appropriate needle in your machine for quilting. That means a needle that's strong and sharp. There are in the store specialty needles that are called quilting needles. Or if you can't find one like that, you can just use a jeans needle. Both of these kinds of needles are both sharp and strong. They need to be sharp to pierce through and strong to go through all those layers of the fabric. If you have those two things ready, then there's just one more thing I want to talk about before we talk specifically about doing the sewing. And that is drag. Now you may have seen tables like this that people use to do their quilting of their quilts on and wondered if you need a table like this. No, you don't need a table that's huge like this. But let me tell you why that is there so you'll know how you can avoid any problems you might have associated with not having a table like that. When you're sewing, your machine uses these little feed dogs underneath the foot and also the feed dogs in your walking foot to move the fabric through so that it makes nice even stitches and so it doesn't stress out the needle. If you have a lot of fabric, like a heavy quilt, hanging down on either side of where the machine is pulling the fabric through, that can make it harder for the machine to pull the fabric through, making your stitches short or even breaking your needle. So that's why people have big giant tables so that the quilt is nice and even and doesn't pull on the needle and the foot as you're sewing. But you don't have to have a big table to avoid that. You can just make sure that you never let your quilt drag. You can just hold it up like this gently as you're sewing so that it doesn't drag and pull as you're sewing along. Okay, so we're all set up and ready to go, right? We have our quilt layered and basted. We have a walking foot to use. We have the right needle in our machine. And we're going to make sure that we hold that quilt up so it doesn't drag and pull as we're doing our sewing. What's next? The next step for me is always picking the thread that I'm going to use to do the quilting on my quilt. If this is your very first quilt, do not be afraid to just use the same exact type of thread that you used when you did the piecing of your quilt. When you use a thread that you're familiar with, you'll know that it will work in your machine. You won't have to play with the tension as much, so it's just fine. If you're curious about other kinds of threads, the differences generally are that the threads labeled quilting thread are a little bit thicker and show up a little bit more on the front of the fabric. There are also other kinds of specialty threads like shiny threads and metallic threads and all sorts of fun things, but I actually would recommend that you stick with the plain old kind of thread that you use to piece your quilt. That way you won't have to deal with anything funky going on differently with your thread when you're also learning how to do your machine quilting stitches. However, you do want to think about what color you're using. The best way to determine if you're going to like the color of a thread when you do the quilting on your quilt is to take a whole bunch of it and just lay it out on the fabric in a big lump like that and see what it looks like. It can blend in, it can stand out, you can do anything you want, but putting it in a lump like this will make it really apparent what it's going to look like when you're doing the quilting on the front of your quilt. One last step before I get started with the quilting is to do a test run. I just have a piece of the same kind of fabric that I used to piece the top, and I put it right on top of the batting here on the edge. And I'm just going to sew a little bit. And then check both the front and the back to see how the tension is. You can see on this, you can sort of see a little bit of the blue dots on the back here, but that's preferable for me. I'm using a very high contrast between the front and the back, which I don't suggest when you're doing your first quilt, but I would rather have these blue dots on the back where no one can see them than have white dots on the front. So I've adjusted my tension so it pulls a tiny bit to the back. But you can adjust your tension just how you want it to. And again, you probably want to use a coordinating fabric on the back so that it's a lot easier to make that tension work nice. Before I show you how to start and end a line of quilting on the front of your quilt, I just wanted to point out one thing. I know that a lot of beginners think that they should do quilting in the ditch. They think that's going to be the easiest design to do on their quilt, and I just want to show you that that's not the case. You should probably avoid doing stitch in the ditch for your first quilt, and let me show you why. If I just talked about stitch in the ditch and you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me just explain this to you. Stitch in the ditch means that you run your quilting lines right here, right along the seam between the pieces. That's different than these quilting lines here that go across in the middle of the pieces or anywhere across other than right along in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch seems like a great idea when you're first starting out because then you don't have to make any decisions about what design you're going to stitch on the front of your quilt. You'll just follow the pieces that you already sewed, right? You don't have to decide whether you're going to make lines this way or lines this way. You can just follow along that line. However, stitching in the ditch is actually one of the hardest things to do in machine quilting. It's an easier thing to do in hand quilting, but in machine quilting it's quite tricky. First, let's talk about what stitching in the ditch means. The ditch is the side of the seam that doesn't have the seam allowances behind it. So you can't really tell in here. Let me show you from the side here. On this seam, both of the seam allowances are pressed this way underneath the light fabric. So if you were to feel right here like I am, this side is higher, so this is the ditch. When we stitch right along the ditch here, right in the ditch and not over on top, then when we're done stitching, the stitches seem to disappear. I've stitched in the ditch here and you can't really quite see it as well, certainly not as well as these here. But you have to be really, really accurate. And being really, really accurate means going very, very slowly. So even me, I go about this fast when I'm stitching in the ditch. The other thing about stitching in the ditch is that you have to be accurate, because if you hop up out of the ditch, it's really, really obvious. It would be much less obvious if you made a wiggle when you were stitching like a ½ an inch away from this seam line. You wouldn't notice this wiggle as much as you notice it right here. So I would avoid stitching in the ditch if you can when you're making your quilting design for your first quilt. All right, starting and stopping when you're doing your machine quilting. It really helps if most of your stitching lines for your machine quilting lines start and end on the edge of a quilt. I will show you in a minute how to do lines that start and stop inside the quilt, or if you have you run out of thread in the middle of the quilt, I'll show you how to deal with that. But let's just start with how to start when you're on the edge of a quilt. So you can start about an inch or so out beyond, put your presser foot down, and then you do not want messes on the back of your quilt, right? So you're going to bring the bobbin thread up, just like you would do if you were bringing up before you started a seam, bringing it up out from the depths of the machine. You just bring it up to the top of the fabric. And then, of course, you'd also put those two back and behind. And then you can just hold them for a minute as you start to do your quilting. Quilting lines that you start on the edge are going to be secured by the fact that you're going to be sewing another seam to sew the binding on here. But when you're starting in the middle of a quilt, like I am with this line right here, you don't have a seam that's coming by later to secure the beginning, so you're going to need to secure the beginning right there where it is. There are 3 different ways that I'm going to show you to do this. So again, you should start with your bobbin thread up on top with your needle thread. And then I am just going to do the easiest one here, which is to sew a couple stitches backwards and then a couple stitches forwards, and then that would be secured. It wouldn't come out in the wash. Another way to start in the middle of the quilt would be to set your stitch length very, very, very short for just a few stitches, and then just take those few stitches and they'll be almost on top of each other, and that will secure it, and then you can lengthen your stitch length again and go ahead and start. You can use these 2 methods as well at the end of a quilting line that's in the middle of a quilt. The third way I'm going to show you is the way that people do it when they do show quilts. You can do this if you want to take the extra time. I'm just going to do it randomly here in the middle of my quilt. I'll be taking this out later, but again, you start by bringing your bobbin thread up and tuck it away, and then you just go ahead, hold those threads down for a couple stitches, and then you just quilt along. And then pretend we get to the end of the spot and it's still in the middle of the quilt. You would just lift this up and you'd pull it out and leave yourself a good long tail. And at the beginning of the quilting line, you can see that there are 2 threads here. You would tie these 2 threads together in a knot and then individually thread each of those threads onto a needle, slip the needle in between the layers of the fabric. I have it in between the layers, it's not going all the way through to the backing, and then I'd pull the thread through, and then I could clip it off and it would go back underneath, and then this line would just start just like that. There would be nothing else showing, and it would be secured because the top and the bottom would be tied together and the threads would be buried underneath. At the other end, you would do the same thing. I find it easiest to take it from the front, but some people do this from the back, take it from the front, and I just pulled on that top thread, and here up comes the bobbin thread. You do the same thing that you did at the beginning of the thread. You tie them together and then bury each of those threads inside. You can see that that's a more complicated way to do that, so I really, especially for your first quilt, and if you're not going to put it in a show, I almost always just do the backing up and over or doing a few short little stitches at the beginning of each quilting line. They hold nicely in the washing machine, especially using the short little stitches, and they're very easy to do and quick to do. There's one last tip I want to give you, and that is that if you are sewing a bunch of parallel lines across your quilt, if you're doing lots of lines like that, you do not necessarily have to mark all those lines on your quilt. If they're very close together, you can sew one straight line across your quilt, maybe following your piecing line or something. Just like this, I could follow my piecing line, line my foot up against it there, and then the next seam I would line that same point on my foot up, and I would get nice parallel lines as I sewed. If you want wider lines than that, almost every walking foot comes with one of these strange looking little things, and it slips into holes in the back of your walking foot, and you can adjust it and secure it at a certain distance, and then you could make lines that are any specific distance apart from each other. It's a really handy way to sew parallel lines on your quilt. So that's the basics of doing straight line machine quilting on your quilt. The most important thing that I can tell you is to relax and take your time. I know when you get to this point, you just want to get it done and there's a tendency to hurry. Just remember to relax and take your time. Remember, you're quilting because you want to have fun. It's supposed to be a peaceful, wonderful, creative outlet for you. So relax and let yourself have fun and let it be easy. The last step is to do the binding, and I do have a video linked there to show you how to do the binding for when you're done with your quilting. But enjoy the quilting process. Let me know if you have any more questions down in the comments. Hope this helps.